Long, long time ago, Edward III was King of England, and he had 10 children. And back in those days, most of the kids didn't live to maturity. Even up until 1900, 50% of kids would die before they reached age 5 or 6. Infectious disease got most of them. But I was thinking about, I've got a speech coming up in Northern Kentucky, and we've got some of the Northern Kentucky contingent here. They won't be here next week, but this is the way I was planning on beginning that speech. I was talking about Edward III. Because he had 10 kids, and they lived to maturity, and within 100 years there were 450 descendants of Edward III. There are now people who say that 97% of all Englishmen, or English men and women, are related to Edward III. So I thought immediately of Bernie Kunkel and the Brueggemann clan up there, because within 100 years most of Northern Kentucky is going to be related to him. And I count them as friends and good defenders of limited government, so I'm hoping that eventually their clans will take over up there. And they're already well on their way. They're very active up there, and I'm glad they were able to come down here today. Many years ago, when Ronald Reagan was going to go to one of his summit meetings with Gorbachev, he was on his way over and he was talking to his aides, and his aides said, "Don't do it." They said there could be international repercussions if you do it. And he did it anyway. He told this story to Gorbachev. It seems there was an accountant in Moscow who had saved for many, many years to buy a car. There was only one manufacturer of the car, was the government. They were crummy, but you had to save for many years, and very few people could afford a car. But he finally got the money, went down to the state-run dealership, and he looked across the table at the bureaucrat selling cars, a government bureaucrat, and he said, "I'll have a car." And the bureaucrat sneered back at him and said, "Well, that's all good and well. Come back in about 10 years and pick it up." And he said, he didn't really miss a beat. He looked at him and he said, "Well, will that be on a Tuesday or a Wednesday?" And he said, "You idiot, I just told you it's going to be 10 years. And you want to know what day of the week your car's going to be ready?" He said, "Well, the plumber's coming on Tuesday and I don't want to miss it." You don't have to look very far, even in our country, to see the inefficiencies of government. People say, "Oh, we want the government to run healthcare because we have so many problems in healthcare." I usually respond by saying, "Well, who would you like to be in charge of it? Maybe the head of FEMA? Did you see how well they distributed the water at the Superdome? Even in the midst of a crisis, the government could not distribute water." So you would think that would be pretty simple. I'll imagine a local businessman here or woman could distribute water if you ask them to, but the government can't do it. Not only could they distribute the water, they had like 3,000 trailers that sat in Arkansas for years, and I think they're still there, never used. You know one of the reasons they were never used? There's a zoning ordinance in New Orleans Parish that says no trailers. Nobody could think, I guess, in this crisis to change the rule. So they sat for years and years, and then finally some people got the trailers. Of course, they decided to sue because they thought something was wrong with the trailers. So you give somebody something for free and they bite your hand and then sue you later on. They also had a lot of ice they sent down to New Orleans. Warehouses of ice. They brought all this ice. It was humanitarian. They're going to do this great thing for these people. They couldn't figure out how to distribute it, so it sat in the warehouse. And I read just recently, this is like, how many years ago is this now? Was it, what year was Katrina? 2003, 2005. 4 years later, they had to hire a contractor to melt the ice because the ice is now past its date. I guess even water gets old, so you can't use the ice, non-potable. But they had to hire someone to melt it and dispose of the water. I mean, this is what you are looking at in government. And people would say, "Well, why is government so bad? Is it so bad because you just have people that aren't as intelligent as they are in the private marketplace?" Well, you could argue that, but really the argument is they don't have a direction. If you have a small feed store or a family dollar store here in town, you have a signal, and you have that signal every month and every day. One signal is prices. Consumers change the price. They change every day based on competition here locally, or if someone wants to drive to Louisville or wherever they're going to drive to shop. You have the price mechanism. The other thing you have is the profit mechanism. You have to make a profit. You have to pay your bills, and you have to have enough left over to live on or to make a profit. Without those things, government flounders, and government tries to distribute things, but they can't do it very well. You look at parts of healthcare that actually work. I do a lot of eye surgery, but I also distribute or sell contact lenses. But if you come into my office in Bowling Green, the contact lenses are almost the same as Walmart. I'm like $1 or $2 more that I think I can get away with over Walmart, but I have to compete. Why? Because the patients mostly pay cash for their contacts. But if you come to me and you're 65 years old and you have Medicare, my price is the same as every doctor in town, every doctor in the state, and every doctor in the entire country. So we don't have capitalism in healthcare. We have fixed prices. Half of what I do is Medicare. That's already socialized medicine, basically. 5% of what I do is Medicaid. That's also government. 45% of what I do, or about 40%, is private insurance, but it's all set too. So if people buy Blue Cross, every doctor in town charges the same for Blue Cross. There's no price competition. So when people say healthcare is a problem and it's not working, that's true, but we have to say, what do we blame it on? Do we blame it on capitalism or the lack of capitalism? And you have to go back to the first question if you want to come up with answers. It's the same way with the banking problem. We had the Great Panic of 2008, is what I call it now. I'm not sure what we'll eventually call it. Hopefully it won't be the Great Depression that began in 2008, but it's at least the Great Panic of 2008. The banks collapsed and failed. What caused this? People say, well, it was, laissez-faire capitalism, or it was lack of regulation or oversight. Well, the only way you can say it was lack of regulation or oversight is to say it was lack of regulation or oversight of the Federal Reserve. The Federal Reserve is part of every transaction in society. They print the money, but they also set the price of the money, which is interest rates. So for 5 years after the dot-com crisis in 2000, you had interest rates of basically zero for 3 or 4 years, and then gradually came up. But the housing boom was spurred by having interest rates that were lower than what the marketplace would determine. I tell people that interest rates should be like insulin. Insulin, when you eat a big meal, your insulin will spike up and follow your blood sugars. And as your blood sugar comes down, your insulin comes down. It matches. Blood sugar and insulin levels match each other when you don't have diabetes. That's the way the marketplace is supposed to work. If things get heated up and Carrollton's having a big boom and people are borrowing money and it's getting bigger and bigger, there's more demand for the money. And so when you have more demand for something, the price of it should rise and the interest rate should rise. And so instead of having 0% interest for 4 or 5 years, we probably would have had 2, 3, 4, 5. It would have been a higher interest rate. I don't know what it would be because nobody knows. That's what the market's supposed to determine. It is a price. Interest rates are the price of money, the same way you have the price of bread or the price of cell phones. There are things in our society that are distributed very well. Look at cell phones. My wife's friends all look at her and laugh because she's got a $14 Go phone. And they all have their fancy phones, and she says, I've got a $14 Go phone, but isn't it a miracle? I can go to Walmart and get a phone for $14. But why are they distributed so well? Why are contact lenses cheap? It's because the price fluctuates, and you can go out and buy competition. It's what you have to have in medicine. But unfortunately, what you have to tell people next, they don't want to hear. You're going to have to pay for your health care, but you pay for it with your dollars. But the trade-off is, if you were to pay for most of your health care with your dollars and add prices, and the prices would fluctuate, your insurance would be a lot less. The ideal solution to what we have is not just giving everyone insurance. The ideal situation is allowing the prices to fluctuate. If they did, in the ideal situation, when you're 20 years old, you would buy a $2,000 deductible. But you would save $2,000 that year, and when you're 21, you would get a $4,000 deductible. And insurance would and should be sold, and we have to figure out how to get to this, like term life insurance. I bought term life insurance 20 years ago, and it doesn't change. If I have a heart attack and drop down here from the stress of this speech tonight, I still, if I don't drop completely dead, my wife will keep paying the same rate, as long as I'm under that term. But that's what you need for health insurance. You need a 20-year term health insurance with a high deductible. Problem is, you got to try to convince people who are over 65 that they need a $2,000 deductible, because it'll save society. But they're going to say, I've got a $100 deductible. Now what would I do with the $2,000 deductible? But what you'd do is you'd open prices. So instead of paying me $125 for an exam, it would open up to fluctuation. Now some doctors say, oh, we're not getting paid enough. I don't know. We might be paying too much. We don't know if we're being paid too much or too little. Open it in the marketplace, and I have a feeling that prices would come down. You'd also have some more competition. You might have to have nurse practitioners being allowed to do some things. You might be allowing pharmacists to do some things, but you'd allow things to come down. But we do have a problem. Right now the problem's being